Jephthah, Jephthah pronounced Hebrew Yīftāḥ, appears in the book of Judges as a judge who presided over Israel for a period of 6 years. Judges 12. According to Judges, he lived in Gilead. His father's name is also given as Gilead, and as his mother is described as a prostitute, this may indicate that his father might have been any of the men of that area. Jephthah led the Israelites in battle against Ammon, and, in exchange for defeating the Ammonites, made a vow to sacrifice whatever would come out of the door of his house first. When his daughter was the first to come out of the house, he immediately regretted the vow which bound him to sacrifice his daughter to God. Jephthah carried out his vow. Traditionally, Jephthah ranks among the major judges because of the length of the biblical narrative referring to him, but his story also shares features with those of the minor judges, such as his short tenure, only 6 years in office. Story. Commentary. Sacrifice of daughter. Jephthah's sacrifice of his daughter stands in stark contrast to the binding of Isaac in the book of Genesis, in which Abraham was about to perform a divinely ordered sacrifice of his son, when an angel of God directly intervened and stopped the sacrifice. Some writers have observed that the Israelites of the time were decidedly barbarous, that Mosaic law which forbade human sacrifice was at this time widely disrespected, and that there are several other examples of rash vows to God with similarly terrible consequences. David Jansen argued that the story was an integral part of the Deuteronomist picture of moral decline through adoption of non-Israelitic practices such as child sacrifice. Solomon Landers believed that the absence of express judgment implies that the sacrifice was not acceptable to God, notwithstanding the fact that the sacrifice nevertheless happened. The book of Judges has been seen as teaching a cycle of pride associated with rejection of God's law and subsequent suffering of the people. Pseudo-Philo's Liber Antiquitatum Biblicarum gives a name for Jephthah's daughter, Selah. Her character is elaborated and emphasized. The author has done his utmost to put this woman on the same level as the patriarchs, in this case especially Isaac. John Chrysostom held that God allowed Jephthah to kill his daughter in order to prevent similar rash vows being made in the future. Ambrose cited the story as an example of how it is sometimes contrary to duty to fulfill a promise or to keep an oath. The Talmud characterizes Yīftāḥ Jephthah as a person of poor judgment, who makes unfitting vows without proper consideration for consequences. Bereshet Rabbah. The Midrash Tanhuma Bechukotai 7 asserts that if Jephthah had read the laws of vows in the Torah, he would not have lost his daughter. The rabbis also ascribe Jephthah's death to his actions as punishment. Jephthah's penalty consists of the shedding of his limbs, which are buried in numerous places, as is learned from Judd 12:7. Then Jephthah the Gileadite died, and he was buried in the towns of Gilead. One limb would slough away and be buried in one location, and then another would fall off. According to some rabbinical commentators, Phinehas also sinned by failing to address the needs of relieving Jephthah of his vow to sacrifice his daughter. As consequence, the high priesthood was taken from him and temporarily given to the offspring of Ithamar, essentially Eli and his sons. Since at least the 12th or 13th century Jewish scholars, among them the compiler and summarizer David Kimhi 1160-1235 and Levi ben Gershon 1288-1344, have taken fulfillment of Jephthah's vow as meaning that he only kept her in seclusion. This view is put forward also by Christian scholars from the 14th century and continues to be propounded today, as by Solomon Landers, who considers it most likely that the fate of Jephthah's daughter was perpetual virginity or solitary confinement. Ethelbert William Bullinger looks at the word and in Jephthah's vow Judges 11:31, "Whatever comes out of the doors of my house to meet me, when I return in peace from the people of Ammon, shall surely be the Lord's, and I will offer it up as a burnt offering." As he explains the Hebrew prefix v that is translated in the above passage as and is often used as a disjunctive, and means or when there is a second proposition. Indeed, this rendering is suggested in the margin of the AV, Bullinger goes on to give examples from the Bible where the same word has been translated as or. According to him, the right translation of this passage is, "Whatever comes out of the doors of my house to meet me, when I return in peace from the people of Ammon, shall surely be the Lord's, or I will offer it up as a burnt offering." Jephthah's daughter, being the first that came out of the house, was thus, according to Bullinger, dedicated to God. He also says, "In any case, it should have been unlawful and repugnant to Jehovah to offer a human being to him as a burnt offering for his acceptance." Such offerings were common to heathen nations at that time, but it is noteworthy that Israel stands out among them with this great peculiarity, that human sacrifices were unknown in Israel. However, in the Hebrew Bible, the same word for burnt offering, Hebrew, only used in reference to Jephthah and his daughter in Judges 11:31, is also used in other biblical stories alluding to human sacrifice, such as the story of Abraham and Isaac, Genesis 22, and Mesh of Moab and his son, 2 Kings 3:27. Moreover, an ol in the Hebrew Bible exemplifies a pure gift to the deity. Thus, Jephthah is not stating an alternative between dedicating something to God and offering it up. Adam Clarke's commentary has an exposition of the issues at stake in this passage and contends that the vow Jephthah made was not as rash as it sounds. The Order of the Eastern Star refers to her as a doll. Possible origins. Israel Finkelstein has suggested that behind multiple and large-scale Deuteronomistic and post-Deuteronomistic additions and redactions, there may lie an oral story which reflects a conflict on the boundary between Israelite and Ammonite settlements in Transjordan around the towns of Gilead and Mizpah. It may have been first written down in the 8th century BCE, when the northern kingdom of Israel Samaria began to collect its heroic tales, royal stories, and foundation myths. Finkelstein has also suggested that the story of Jephthah's vow may have been added into the story as late as the Hellenistic period. The 18th century French philosopher Voltaire noted the similarities between Jephthah and the mythical Cretan general Aidoneus, speculating whether one story had in fact imitated the other. Aidoneus had asked the gods to calm a storm, promising in return that he would sacrifice the first living thing he saw upon his return, which turned out to be his son. The story of Jephthah's daughter is also sometimes compared to that of Agamemnon's daughter Iphigenia. In his play Jephthah's Sive Bottom Jephthah or the Vow, the Scottish scholar and dramatist George Buchanan (1506–1582) called Jephthah's daughter Iphiz, obviously alluding to Iphigenia, and Handel's 1751 oratorio, Jephthah, based on Buchanan's play, uses the same name. Cultural influences. The story of Jephthah has influenced a number of literary works. Historia di Jephthah, an oratorio by Giacomo Carissimi. Jephthah's Sive Bottom, a tragedy by George Buchanan, 1554. Jephthah of Offerbeloft, a play by Joost van den Vondel, 1659, a reworking in Dutch of the play by Buchanan. Two treatises of government, a political and theological book John Locke, 1689, challenging the divine right of kings, using Jephthah to demonstrate his appeal to heaven for changing government by the use of force in the absence of an earthly authority to petition to. See Book Roman 2, Section 21. This concept is extremely important in First Amendment jurisprudence and is one of the strongest arguments against temporary restraining orders that enjoin speech, also known as a prior restraint, because of how dangerous they are. See, for example, Milk Wagon Drivers v. Meadowmore Dairies, Inc., 312 U.S. 287,293, 1941. Jephthah, an opera by Mitchell Pignolet, de Monteclair, 1732. Jephthah, the oratorio by George Friedrich Handel, 1751. Songs from Oratorio of Jephthah by John H. Hewitt, 1845. Jephthah's Beloved, an opera on the story by Meyerbeer. The Vow, an opera by Colin McAlpin. The story of Jephthah and his daughter is the subject of Lion Feuchtwanger's historical novel, Jephthah und seine Tochter, 1957, English translation. Jephthah and His Daughter, also known as Jephthah and His Daughter, published 1958. In Hamlet, Polonius tells Hamlet, "If you call me Jephthah, my lord, I have a daughter I love passing well." The 2015 winner of the BP Portrait Award, Annabelle and Guy by Matin Ben Sinan, was inspired by the story of Jephthah and his daughter. The 2008 novel Ever by Gail Carson Levine is based on the story of Jephthah's daughter. Judges 1134 is quoted in the foreword, and the plot follows the story of a girl in a Bronze Age Middle Eastern-inspired society whose father promises to sacrifice to his god the first person who congratulates him on his wife's recovery from an illness.